Hey everyone, welcome back to Gender Justice with Silver Linings. I'm Mariah Silver. First order of business, I'm going to be in Charleston, South Carolina this week at the Sexual Violence in the Law Conference, so stay tuned for some interesting content that comes out of that conference this week. But let's dive into what we're going to be talking about today. It's something that's been in the news, in the media almost every single day. And there's been some really interesting conversations coming out of it. And if any of you are mind readers, then you know that what I'm talking about is the Larry Nassar case. So for those of you who haven't been following along, Larry Nassar is a well-known doctor. He worked for the University of Michigan. He also was very well known because he worked with the U.S. Olympic gymnastics program. And for those of you who've been following, he's just been sentenced this week for state crimes for 40 to 175 years in prison. So let's back up. We're going to break all this down and we're going to talk about the case a little bit. So let's start from the beginning. So Larry Nassar was actually sentenced already for federal child pornography crimes. So what does this mean? It means that he pled guilty to these federal child pornography crimes. What most people don't know is that Larry Nassar was found with 37,000 child pornography images. That is astounding. And what is more shocking and disturbing is that some of those images were actually of his victims. So he has already pled guilty and we've already had him sentenced for that. So let's set that aside for a second. So what we've been hearing about in the news recently is actually the state case. It's the state of Michigan versus Larry Nassar. So in this case, in this state case, he was charged with first-degree child molestation. There were 7 victims involved in this particular state case, and he also pled guilty to those crimes. So what's key here is that what we've been looking at in the media with all the women coming forward, hearing their impact statements, hearing the judge sentence him, all of that is what's called the sentencing phase. Now, the sentencing phase is completely separate from a trial phase where guilt or innocence is being determined usually by a jury of your peers. In this case, he pled guilty, so there wasn't a jury trial. So we're in the sentencing phase. This is a phase where victims can come forward and give what are called victim impact statements. These are statements to the court telling the court, this is how the abuse I suffered at the hands of Nassar has impacted me and my life. And it gives the judge an opportunity to hear how this case has impacted individuals and the community, which she can consider when she sentences him for these crimes. So that's why we saw all of these women coming into court and sharing their stories. So Larry Nassar, as you may have noted, the news said he was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison. What on earth does that mean? 40 is a lot different than 175. So judges, when they sentence people, it varies per state, but in general, they're looking at aggravating and mitigating factors to either increase how much time someone spends in prison or maybe decrease it if there are mitigating factors. So the judge here is considering all these women to assess, are there more aggravating factors? So when she said 40 years, what she meant was at a minimum, the minimum that he is allowed to be sentenced to for these particular crimes is 40 years in prison. So it will be 40 years before he's even allowed to be paroled, meaning that before he would ever go before a parole board, he would have to sit in prison for 40 years. Okay, then what's with the 175? The 175 is the upper limit. So he has to spend a minimum of a minimum of 40 years, but no more than 175 years. So why did she do that? She stated why she did that. She's sending a message to the parole board that for whatever reason, if he came up for parole, she wants the parole board to understand the gravity of this case and what was done. And that's the message she's sending by saying the maximum is 175 years in jail. Now, let's do some quick math. I'm a lawyer, so forgive my math skills, but bear with me. We've got him sentenced for federal crimes for 60 years. We've got him now sentenced in state court just recently to a minimum of 40 years in prison. Okay, so that's a minimum of 100 years in prison. Larry Nassar is 54 years old. So that means that he wouldn't be paroled until he's 154 years old. So one of the key statements that was posted in the media about this case was that the judge told Nassar, "I've just signed your death warrant." Very ominous words. The reason she said that because but for modern science or some ability to magically live to 154 years old, Larry Nassar will very likely die in prison. So that's why we saw the judge making those statements that I've signed your death warrant. So I hope that explains a little bit about some of those weird numbers and the sentencing and the victim impact statements and what that all meant. But what I did want to shift focus to a little bit was some things that the judge said when she sentenced Larry Nassar that I actually found a little disturbing, because most of what the judge said in the sentencing was deeply powerful and impactful and empowering towards the victims who had been harmed by Nassar. But she did say a few things that I thought maybe went too far and distracted from the important message that she was trying to send. So the first is one that I already mentioned, which is I've just signed your death warrant. So regardless of what your opinion is, the criminal justice system has come under a lot of scrutiny. Many even call it the injustice system. And it's largely believed by activists and others that it's a very, very broken system. So it made me uncomfortable that she was glorifying in some way the idea that we were sentencing him to death or that he was somehow going to be sent to the guillotine. It just brought up that imagery. And she's supposed to be impartial and unbiased. And what was interesting to me was that she was taking it a step a little too far, again, by glorifying this idea that we're sending him off to his death. Now, for whatever anger you have towards Larry Nassar, our criminal justice system, in my opinion, isn't a place where we should be excited or fantasizing in any way about sending someone to their death, and that's very exciting to us as a society. That just doesn't feel right. So the second statement that I'm going to point out that she made that sort of had me question, I actually find a little more disturbing. So the judge, while she was sentencing Larry Nassar, said to him, "But for our Constitution prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, I would sentence you to experience what you did to these girls yourself by someone or people over and over again." Now I'm paraphrasing what she said. So some of you may be ruffling your eyebrows a little. I think here she made a huge misstep that distracted severely from the point of this entire trial, the media around it, and the important discussion about sexual violence. How do we end it and how do we speak up? So she essentially said that if it wasn't for the Constitution prohibiting it, she would think about sentencing him to a lifetime of rape. Now that's deeply disturbing. One, it really upsets me because the prison system has a rape problem, a very real one, where sexual violence is extremely common in the prison system. So it disturbs me that she would bring that up. It also disturbs me, secondly, because it really distracts and pulls away from what these women experience. These young women, over 150 of them, were abused and molested and tormented by Larry Nassar. And we're finding that deplorable, so much so that she sentenced him to up to 175 years in jail, rightfully so, in my opinion. And yes, he should spend the rest of his life in jail because he's a danger to our society, our communities, and he should be removed. And he needs help. He's clearly unwell. But to say that we want to do to him what he did to others, that starts sounding a little biblical, an eye for an eye. And if we want to extend that, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. So, if we find it deplorable that anyone would ever be raped or subject to that torment and trauma, there's no way that we should be saying that as punishment, Nassar should experience the same thing. So those are the things that had me concerned about what she said. But there are some things that I want to highlight. Her statements to the court were incredible. She made very powerful statements straight to the victims who were sitting in the audience and watching Larry Nassar be sentenced to this crime. She made powerful statements about them healing, about them being believed, about them being able to tell their truth. She did something truly transformative that's rarely seen in the criminal justice system. She made the courtroom a safe place for these young women to come forward and share their stories. Stories that are scary, that are traumatizing, that make them vulnerable, and all while they have to face the person who did it to them. So for her to transform that courtroom that way is incredible. And really, I think, sends an important message to how can we create safe spaces in courtrooms around the country for victims like this to be able to come forward and not fear the judges, not fear the police, and not fear our justice system. So that's me blabbing on about Larry Nassar. I'm going to do some major shifting of gears here. We're keeping on our legal eagle hats, but I'm going to talk to you about the First Amendment. So you're probably like, what the hell is she talking about? Why is she talking about the First Amendment? The reason I'm going to talk to you about the First Amendment relates actually directly to the Larry Nassar case. So I'm specifically going to talk about the First Amendment and freedom of the press. The reason that I'm going to talk about this is historically, freedom of the press has enabled investigative journalism to uncover some of the deepest evils in our society and shine a light in very, very dark places. And this ranges, like I said, throughout our history. Investigative journalists looking into things and unveiling parts of our world that we've never seen and that we've turned our eyes from or have been silenced. This is everything from the Pentagon Papers to Watergate to more recent things. If y'all remember the Steubenville rape case, that was very prominent in the news several years ago. Steubenville high school students sexually assaulted a student and filmed it. This was all uncovered by an investigative journalist. If you have been following the Harvey Weinstein case, the same goes for the Harvey Weinstein case. This case was uncovered by investigative journalists who spent time gaining the trust of victims who were scared and traumatized and didn't know where to go. They spent time ensuring that these individuals could tell their stories. That is critical. And the reason it's critical is because we've seen it in particular with cases of sexual violence and even cases of other types of domestic violence and such. So, women seem to not be going to the police, or if they do, maybe they don't feel like it's taking them where they need to be. They don't necessarily go to mentors in their community or to others to disclose this information. But what we have seen is that investigative journalists have invested incredible amounts of time and energy in working with victims to make them feel safe and share their story in a way that allows all of us to see these dark places and try and deal with these issues in our society. This is so important that if you remember the film Spotlight, which was about a section of the Boston Globe, which did investigative journalism. Now, the Spotlight film was very, very popular, won a lot of awards, and it focused on investigative journalism that unveiled the significant abuse committed in the Catholic Church against young boys. So it's pretty incredible if you think about it. And the Larry Nassar case wasn't broken by women who had gone to the police or victims who said they had already gone to Michigan State University to report these crimes. In fact, someone did in 2014 go to report Nassar for committing sexual assault. The case was investigated and it was found that he was not responsible for whatever the conduct was, which is questionable considering what we know now about Nassar and about his victims. So the Indianapolis Star is the one that blew open this case. And it was because of one victim, one gymnast, who was willing to come forward and share what Nassar had done to her. Rachel Denhollander, a gymnast who had been abused by Nassar and was the last to give her victim impact statement at Larry Nassar's sentencing. So, in the wake of all of our criticism of journalism recently, all of this talk of fake news, I think it's important to remember, especially when we're talking about issues of sexual violence that are deeply silenced and victims who are suffering severe trauma or fear, feelings of vulnerability, feelings of feeling alone or like they won't be believed, that investigative journalism has found a way into working with these individuals, allowing them to share their stories with all of us, and that's pretty powerful. So, we've broken down a lot about the Larry Nassar case. Before we end, I like to always end with a silver lining. So we're going to spend a lot of time here talking about things that are really disturbing, really upsetting, and so I want to end with a silver lining. So a silver lining for me about this case is that we focused on the individual who committed these crimes, Larry Nassar. He's being held accountable, at least criminally, by our legal system. So, what's the next step? How on earth was this allowed to happen? If anyone remembers the Jerry Sandusky case at Penn State University, which took down the athletic program for incredible amounts of horrific abuse that was being experienced at the hands of Jerry Sandusky, you'll remember that that case, like I said, worked its way up to so many different levels at that school and took down so many different people who were so renowned, who had known about the abuse in some way or another and didn't do anything. So, silver lining for this case, This case, the Larry Nassar case, now is bleeding into the rest of the state of Michigan, the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan president has stepped down. It is also bled into U.S. Olympics. The Olympic Committee has resigned entirely. The USA Gymnastics Committee has resigned entirely. So why is that a silver lining? Because we can find the person who's committed these crimes, but to really prevent and end sexual violence, we need to end the cultures, the people who are making this happen, creating structures and systems where these issues can go unnoticed and unspoken of. So my silver lining is that this is going to continue. This isn't going to stop. This started with Nassar, but these young women are starting a movement that's really starting to take down key players who had involvement or should have known or should have done something, and sending a message that this can't happen again. So, thank you for joining me today. I know we've talked about a lot. I'm really excited about being in Charleston this week, so I look forward to talking with you more from the Victim Rights Law Center Sexual Violence in the Law Conference. Thanks so much for listening.